What's up, friends? Welcome back to the show. Today I spoke to the brilliant Dr. Alexis Cowan. She is a quantum biology and light expert. She's a PhD from Princeton University, is now running her own lab, and we have our conversation all about your light diet. Like, what is blue light exactly, and how does it damage cells? What does she mean when she says make mitochondria great again? Why she did our podcast sitting outside in the sunshine? Everything to do with your eye health. Is Lasik actually dangerous? And what is the problem with sunglasses? I asked for her perspective, a scientist's perspective, on sunning your balls. And of course, while we were on the topic of sun, we addressed the elephant in the room. Does the sun cause skin cancer? This is a fascinating conversation. You are going to be taken to school today. She is a very bright lady, pun intended in every way. Get ready to learn. Let's dive into it with Dr. Alexis Cowan. Dr. Alexis Cowan, welcome to the show. Like a proper mitochondriac, you are calling me from outside today, getting all of the full spectrum light from the sun and grounding and breeze in your hair, looking like a lioness with a mane, and just going to spit some wisdom on us today. So, before we dive in, I do need you to set the scene a little bit on who you are, what you do, because you're a very smart and intelligent person, and a lot of today's stuff is going to have to be grounded for our listener who's kind of new to the bioenergetics or the quantum space. So take us on a little bit of a journey, and we'll see where we go after that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you today. I completed my PhD at Princeton in 2021 in the Rabinowitz lab, which is one of the top metabolism research labs in the world. After graduating, I started my business working with clients and athletes one-on-one, also teaching classes, primarily microbiome focused. At the time, I thought that was the most important thing that needed to be focused on. And, I was going about my business or whatever. I ended up going back for a postdoc in 2023 at University of Pennsylvania, working on some tech development there. And it was during this time that I came across the work of Dr. Jack Kruse on the Tetragrammaton episode with Huberman and Rick Rubin. And my entire life basically flipped upside down overnight. And I was like, wow, I was really blindsided because all of the circadian biology, I had been familiar with it through Sachin Panda's work and others, but for whatever reason, it just didn't come across as like extremely important and like the thing that nobody was focusing on. But the way Jack presented the information and laid out the evolutionary landscape and presented the information, it just really resonated with like every fiber of my being. And I immediately went down the rabbit hole, discovered that all of the things that he was saying with regards to biology and melanin and light and the light environment, the importance of that was all true. As I go into the centralized literature, the same centralized literature that will tell you that the sun is bad, that's, fueling centralized dermatologists and ophthalmologists to tell you to block UV light at every turn and wear sunscreen and this and that. But the same literature will tell you that having chronic, regular, daily sun exposure is protective against a whole host of diseases, from all-cause mortality to cardiovascular disease, dementia and cognitive decline, diabetes, multiple autoimmune diseases including MS, Parkinson's disease, and multiple cancer types, including melanoma, which, much to my shock, because the propaganda around that very clearly says, like, any amount of UV light exposure is essentially bad for you. And we're going to unpack, of course, why that's not the case, but it really couldn't be further from the truth. So that's kind of the path of how I got to where I am now, where I've revamped my business. I now teach almost exclusively quantum biology concepts, which relates to light, water, and magnetism, essentially, which are these foundational pillars to the pyramid of health upon which mitochondrial health and function is built. And that's why, in the health space, it's very focused on movement, like diet and exercise, essentially. There's a lot missing there, because in order to create mitochondria that are healthy enough to even process the nutrients you're taking in and to engage in the movement practices you want to engage in, we have to have these pillars of light, dark, water, and magnetism intact to build upon that with a healthy diet and a healthy movement practice and sleep and all of those things. So that's kind of how I got to where I am right now, working with pro athletes, working also like building coursework out of my business to educate the masses on these important topics. And I should probably also mention that I've always been a bit of a rebel in the centralized or academic sphere, let's say. I never really ever appealed to authority in my entire life. I had a lot of health issues as a kid that centralized medicine never had a good answer for me, and so I just suffered immensely as a result of that. And so I was very acutely aware of the shortcomings of that system from an age as early as like 5 or 6 years old.
Mm,
And so that really motivated me to always, I mean, I've always just been a very curious person as well, wanting to know things for myself and not taking anything for granted. Like just because somebody said it, I'm not going to think that it's true. And exactly like I said for Jack too, when I heard him, it resonated in my being as being true. And then I verified and I was like, wow, like this is mind blowing. And so when I ended up going to undergrad, actually out of culinary school, I pivoted to going into science. I studied biochemistry and math at Moravian College, and then took a gap year. Actually worked in pharma for a little bit, and was really shocked to see that basically all the people who worked there, they really thought they were doing good and like saving
mm,
the world through pharmaceutical approaches and like immunotherapies and other, kind of cutting edge approaches in pharmaceuticals, not realizing that we're not addressing any of the root issues that are driving the diseases to begin with. And so I was immediately very discontent being in that environment, and transitioned into Princeton and the academic world. And of course, like Princeton's a great school. I didn't really have any kind of perspective going into it. I really chose it because it was close enough to commute to, and I applied and I got accepted. And so it ended up working out, and I found in that lab that I ended up being a very good fit. And I studied ketogenic diet, and also like disparate dietary inputs and how it shapes metabolism, high
mm.
fat, like ketogenic diet versus high carb diet versus fasting and feeding. So I was basically looking at how metabolism shifts in response to different dietary inputs or lack thereof. And so as Jack would say, I really was kind of a food guru back then, though I would still not identify with that fully because there's just something about it that never really fully clicked. Like there's got to be something more here because our culture is so fixated on diet and exercise, and yet people are fatter and sicker than ever. And so it always kind of felt like something was missing. And so when I heard Jack speak for the first time, it was just like a bunch of puzzle pieces clicking into place, and it kind of set me on what seems to be a divine mission in my perspective.
Oh, that is so good. I resonate with a lot of what you just said. Not the understanding Jack Cruz to the level that you can, and not the PhD, but the rebellious spirit of this kind of decentralized path, becoming your own doctor in a sense, really learning, really questioning things, being failed by the centralized model is very similar to story than I've been in, and I would classify myself as a recovering food guru that's becoming more holistic and looking at these things because I'm trying to kind of square the circle of these different inputs. Like obviously food is very important, obviously movement is, but you said something, I think you said prioritizing the quantum, prioritizing the light and those things. We could have the best diet in the world cooked by the best chefs, but if we lived inside in a house that was riddled with EMFs and never got the sunshine, I don't think in a few weeks we're going to come out of there feeling very good and feeling very healthy. So, what is it that you learned about light, and why is light the most important thing to you, or why is it the priority that comes before other things?
Yeah, so I mean, I should start by saying because at a very fundamental level, biology is decentralized, which means that there's not one most important controller. So where light is extremely important, dark is equally as important. So light and dark cycles are two primary inputs that will shape our biological outputs, let's say. So we can talk about that in the context of circadian biology, which is the study of the 24-hour cycles within the body. So the primary Zeitgeber or time giver that sets the circadian clock, which is this master clock that's connected to the back of the eye called the suprachiasmatic nucleus or the SCN. The retina basically can sense light from the environment, and we'll talk about what kind of light in a little bit. And then that retina sends a signal via the RHT or the retinohypothalamic tract that connects to the hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that serves as like the thermostat for the entire body. But there's a part of the hypothalamus called the SCN that serves as this master clock that sets the timekeeping for all cells downstream, like all throughout the rest of the body. And timing is really everything in life and in biology. And so if the timing is off, cells don't know when to engage in the proper functions at the right time, and that creates chaos in terms of biology. We can think of chaos as molecular chaos, as inflammation. And so when we have that light coming into the eye and that circadian clock is set, that is allowing the body to know that it's daytime. So in particular, blue light is the primary signal that tells the body and the brain that it's midday. And there are certain functions that are associated with being daytime. That would include things like digestion, movement, cognition, energy, alertness. These are all functions that correspond to daytime in contrast to nighttime when it's dark. We really need that darkness, and so many modern humans are throwing on all the lights in the house when it starts to get dark outside, when it starts to be around sundown, and they're on their screens up through bedtime. Some people even sleep with the TV on or have lights on in the room, and so the biology is never receiving that darkness input that's required to shift the biology into the other most important circuit. There's the light and then the dark. And the dark is really associated with regenerative capacities, wound healing, restoration, cellular turnover.
Mm,
So these are all the functions that are associated with darkness or nighttime. And so if we don't have either the bright light from the sun during the day or that darkness at night, we are going to fall short from a circadian perspective. Worth noting here that both bright light and blue light are important from a circadian perspective. So I should also mention that the lights that we use inside, the white LED and fluorescent bulbs, all of our device screens are highly enriched in blue light, and they're completely missing red and infrared light. We'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a moment. But that blue light from the screens, our body's basically interpreting that as it would, encountering blue light from nature, because midday sun is 25% blue light, 50% red and infrared light. And so in nature, we get that balance, and that red and
mm,
infrared light actually can penetrate into the body, in particular the near infrared light can penetrate into the body from 360 degrees if you're outside, and it directly can tickle the mitochondria to stimulate energy and water production. In contrast, blue light, especially blue light in isolation, actually has the opposite effect. So we know from the research that blue light in isolation, which we do find in our LEDs, fluorescent bulbs, and device screens, can actually impair mitochondrial function on our surfaces, which include our skin, eyes, and proximal brain regions. So in nature, we never encounter blue light without an abundance of red and infrared light
mm,
to achieve that balance at the mitochondrial level. So if we're encountering, let's say we're even living inside and we're getting that blue light from our screens or indoor lights, that's at least consistent with blue light exposure outside, but we're missing that near infrared component because, like I said, all of our tech and lights, because they're energy efficient, have been engineered to lack near infrared light or infrared light in general, also known as heat. Heat is seen as a waste product because it
mm,
is not contributing to the brightness of the light source, not realizing that infrared light is actually an essential nutrient to the human bodies. That's how it needs to be thought of. And so if we're on those screens, we're getting that blue light in the absence of that near infrared light. And in addition to that, the brightness of the indoor environment is also lacking. So midday sun can be up to 300,000 lux in brightness. Most indoor environments never get over 1,000 lux. So we're
mm.
really um, selling ourselves short on the brightness side of things, which is also incredibly important from a neurochemistry standpoint and that circadian standpoint. It helps to stimulate the synthesis of serotonin, other neurotransmitters as well, that helps to, give us good mental health, but also physiological health and digestion and all of these things. So also worth noting is even if you're inside without any light bulbs on or any devices in your face, that you're already running into an issue because standard window glass blocks 100% of UVB light, and we didn't talk about UV light yet, but we will. Blocks 100% of UVB light, 30% of UVA light, and about 100% of near infrared light, again, because they are energy efficient, and that near infrared light can come into the windows and basically heat up the interior. And so if you want to have a lower energy bill, you want to prevent that heat from coming in through the windows. But again, it's not realizing that that near infrared light is actually a critical input to the human body to stimulate and support the mitochondria and its health. And so simply sitting inside behind window glass or in a car behind window glass, you're already in effect concentrating the blue light part of the spectrum and becoming blue light toxic because you're lacking that UV and infrared input to round out the blue light in the spectrum.
Hmm. You've said the M word a few times, or even start the conversation with it, mitochondria. Some of our listeners
My
might go
shirt.
back to high school biology, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. What does it mean to make mitochondria great again?
Yeah, so mitochondria are these units within cells called organelles that make the bulk of the energy and metabolic water that our cells require for baseline function and also optimal function as well. So the as I mentioned in the intro, light, dark, water, and magnetism are really this foundation to the pyramid of mitochondrial health. And we can really think about mitochondria as being both electromagnetic emitters and detectors. So not only are mitochondria sensing the electromagnetic environment, which includes the light environment, the infrared light, the UV light, the blue light, they're also sensing the non-native EMFs in the environment, which is in the form of 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc. So they're detecting that and they're responding to that. And worth noting is that these non-native EMFs, as the name implies, are not something that our biology has encountered before. There are radio waves that come in, from space, but it's a very, very small amount. Most of it gets reflected out back into space. And so these frequencies of light are, there's a bee flying around me. These frequencies of light we're not meant to encounter them. Our biology doesn't know how to deal with them. And so we're encountering this hyper novelty which is in general just a big problem with the modern environment. We have this hypernovelty where our biology doesn't know how to respond because they're new signals, and it's creating some level of chaos. Oh my God, bee, go away. It's trying to fly in my
He's
drink.
Yeah, he's buzzed. He's attracted to your light, is what he's doing right now. So
Maybe.
welcome to the show,
Maybe.
special guest B. So I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
Special
what you're
guest.
describing is really fascinating to me because I started when I had my meat pill awakening or whatever you want to call it. It was very much through this ancestral lens, and what you're describing is a broad scale evolutionary mismatch, an evolutionary mismatch of light, of food, of movement, of stimulus, of the fact that we live in this toxic EMF soup. All of it kind of creates a very novel environment that the human being hasn't really evolved to know what the heck to do with. So that's confusing, and it causes a milieu of problems, like a death by a thousand paper cuts, I guess. Where would you start with someone? You get someone that might be just in this centralized life, the domesticated human, not free range yet, not decentralized. Where do you start with them? What's something practical that you get them to start implementing ASAP to see improvements in their health?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just continue riffing for a little bit because the bee interrupted me, and then I'll answer your question.
Please.
So I just want to clarify that when I say electromagnetic spectrum, this is referring to both the electrical and magnetic components of our environment. So that includes the light in the environment, which could be artificial light or natural light from the sun, moon, stars, bioluminescence, etc. But the magnetic part of that also refers to the Schumann resonance, which is this pulsed electromagnetic frequency that's formed as
Mm,
a result of lightning striking the planet. And it's actually the frequency of the Schumann resonance is 7.83 hertz, which is identical to the alpha wave in the brain. So there's this really interesting link between like the pulse of nature and the pulse of our alpha wave that gives us kind of this very cerebral creative state.
mm,
And we also have the magnetic field of the earth, which we're supposed to be connected to by, if you're getting outside bare feet on the ground. This also goes with your question. What I'm really trying to get people to do is get outside more bare feet on the earth, whether it's, grass, sand, concrete, any natural surface, stone, you can ground through. And grounding is basically the transmittance of free energy from the earth into your body. So you can ground on any natural surface, which would include the stone, sand, gravel, grass, dirt, concrete, even. And when you have your bare feet on these surfaces, especially if they're damp or wet in any way, that allows you to get free electrons from the earth. And those electrons are essentially what powers your mitochondria. So if we think about when we're eating food, what we're really doing is we're eating for protons and electrons. These are the subatomic units that are actually powering the production of energy and metabolic water at the level of the mitochondria. And we get electrons from many different things. So in the modern day, what we really are missing is two out of the three pillars of human bioenergetics. So we're eating the food and we're getting some electrons and protons that way. But what we're not getting is the free electrons from the earth, from getting our bare feet and our palms on natural surfaces. And there's also another way we can get free electrons, which is through melanin in our skin splitting water in response to sunlight. So when sunlight
mm,
stimulates the melanin in our skin, which is what gives us a tan, or if you're somebody with naturally darker skin, you have plenty of melanin. And equatorial environments have evolved darker skin. It's not just for protection against UV light, it's actually to harness high energy, high photonic energy sunlight to make free energy. So you actually have to eat
mm,
less. And when we unpack the UV light story, we can see that UVB light in particular, in addition to stimulating the production of vitamin D, it's also critical for stimulating the production of pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC, which is this complex hormone that's cleaved into 10 different hormonal products, and three of them are alpha, beta, and gamma MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. So, as the name implies, these hormones stimulate the production of new melanin and melanocytes in response to the sun. So, that's what helps you get a tan. But
mm,
in addition to that, alpha MSH also works in the hypothalamus to decrease appetite and increase energy expenditure. So, what our biology is actually telling us is if we're getting enough UVB light, we don't need to eat because we're actually making free energy, and that should be reflected at the level of our appetite. We're not going to feel compelled to eat anything. And there's huge implications here with regards to the obesity epidemic as well, because from a bioenergetic standpoint, if we're constantly blocking UV light, we're slopping the sunscreen, we're wearing sunglasses or like UV reflecting contacts or prescription glasses, and we're just, covering up when we go outside, that lack of UV light is actually suppressing energy expenditure and increasing appetite, because now you need to eat
mm,
more food in order to make ends meet, essentially, at a bioenergetic level. So it becomes no surprise that actually, if you're highly deprived of UV light, that you have a more uncontrollable appetite. and also more compulsivity in general. So, three of the other hormonal products from POMC are alpha, beta, and gamma endorphin, the endogenous opioid molecules that literally act like, morphine and the drugs that people gravitate towards. And if you look at like the opioid epidemic we're having here in the States, also completely perfectly makes sense in the context of a deficiency in UVB light in particular, because these endogenous opioids, they make us feel good, they decrease anxiety and depression, they increase pain tolerance, they also improve learning and memory and cognition, and overall increase our baseline dopamine level so that we're better able to critically think and make good decisions. And so there's so many implications here, because if you think about people who have addictions to whatever it is, drugs and alcohol, pornography, fast food, social media, device screens, and all of this is all basically because we are operating from a deficit and we're constantly looking for
Hmm.
our next hit of dopamine to help us get by, not realizing that nature intended for us to be addicted to the sun. And when we are out in the sun and getting that UV light midday, that it's allowing us to just feel content at a baseline level. Like we don't need to do anything or need to get anything outside of us, that we're already operating from a place of fullness. So there's also like a psycho-spiritual aspect to the whole light story too that really can't be denied. And I mean, if you look at like Genesis in the Bible, it's really, there's a lot about light there, and I don't think
Hmm.
that's by accident either. And so I think we really have just strayed a long way from natural light, from the sun, and the fact that our culture is like the only culture in history that has ever demonized the sun, I think speaks volumes to our detachment from nature and our detachment from our own natures as well.
Yeah, it's like we're living in the upside down, right? Like
Yeah.
older cultures literally worship the sun, as
Mm-hmm.
obviously they knew that it was the life giver. And it's funny you mentioned the psycho spiritual side of things, because yeah, enlightenment or shining your light, or quotes in different religious scriptures. It's funny as well. I've heard you talk about one of your awakening moments was an LSD trip, and that's kind
Yeah.
of an enlightenment, right? It's a breaking down of substructures, thoughts, beliefs, ego. It's very interesting to me that this light piece is central not only to metabolism, the thing that we often get fixated on when we think of food and losing weight, but also spiritual health, psychological health, battling the rampant addiction crises that we have with phones and tech, because it seems like people are stuck right now in a loop where they need more of this because they're not getting it from nature, and then they're actually poisoning themselves with a low dose of the screens and the very things that are robbing them of that vitality. So hearing you speak, it's almost like we are solar panels in a way, right? The more natural light we can get, the more we're actually harnessing that as energy, and therefore the less requirements we need from these other areas. And by factor of being outside getting the light, we're probably grounding, we're breathing cleaner air, and all of these other free gains as well. What is it specifically about blue light that is harmful, in terms of like, does it actually damage cells, and why?
Yeah, so blue light, there's a few things. Blue light, like I mentioned, directly can impair mitochondrial function on the surfaces, so there's that piece. There's also the fact that blue light hijacks the dopamine reward pathways, and in nature, like I mentioned earlier, blue light peaks middle of the day. We want to have cognition, we want to have alertness that's associated with midday behaviors and activities that we need to actually thrive and survive. And so blue light in isolation really just takes that to the next level. It's addicting. And if you look at the patents from Google and Meta, et cetera, you can see that like they know these devices are sticky. They engineered them to be that way.
Hmm.
There's actually a whole, rabbit hole you could go down as well with regards to MK Ultra and this light technology literally being implemented and researched to control people.
Say
And I
more.
think that's working too. Like if we look at, across our population and across the Western world in general, like everybody has a device. Even some people who are homeless have smartphones. So like we're living just glued to these screens, completely detached from reality, and in that state we're so easily influenced because not only is the blue light making us more impressionable, but we're also receiving we have a filter on the information that's coming to us through algorithms, etc., that is actually basically dictating what information we're even exposed to begin with, and that create a lot of issues from like echo chambers to misinformation, which is a whole other can of worms. But it's just like we're completely detached from actual reality and we're in this weird digital realm. So essentially what I like to say is like we've unplugged from the actual matrix and now we're plugged into the pseudo matrix, and it's costing us the health of our physical bodies.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. It seems that if we keep going the way that we're going, we're walking, right off a cliff, and everybody's just got their heads down in the phones, willy-nilly, not paying attention. Like, look up, as you were saying. I was watching your stories yesterday. Just look up what's happening in the sky, weather manipulation, all kinds of things. But you have to unplug, and then plug back into the right stuff. So,
Totally. There's one other thing I want to mention that I didn't yet, but you alluded to it with like the concept of enlightenment. And
mm,
there's this idea that like when you're with somebody, you can sense a spark that maybe you don't necessarily interpret when we're like having a digital conversation. There's just an
mm,
energetic aspect to interpersonal relationships in flesh and blood that are different. And this comes down to biophoton production. So the mitochondria, like I mentioned earlier, in addition to sensing the light environment, they're also emitting light. So if you get an infrared camera, you can look at somebody on it and you can see them, and that's because
mm,
we create heat, aka infrared light, and that's allowing us to maintain our internal body temperature, our core temperature, which is around like 98.6 degrees or whatever. At least it was. It's dropped by a whole degree over the past century, which I think is
mm.
directly pointing to our mitochondrial dysfunction. The electrical grid actually rolled out around that time too, that we started to see the decline in the core temperature, which I think is interesting. The grid basically rolling out in the late 1800s, and then the electrification of homes really starting in the early 1900s, etc. So that was kind of the beginning of the end in that context. But in addition to making infrared light, the mitochondria can also make UV biophotons. And I think when I learned this, it was just so striking to me because what I learned was, in the summertime when we have plenty of sun quality is high, we have more UV light, we also have longer days, that our body is soaking up this UV and infrared light and it's able to use it productively and power energy production and just overall support, hormonal aspects as well and everything, and metabolism too. But in the wintertime, when it's cold and the days are short in more northern latitudes, what did our biology do? It evolved a way to make its own infrared and UV light in the absence of UV and infrared light inputs from the sun because the days are short and the UV index is basically zero for a portion of the
Wow.
year. And so turns out when you get cold, it stimulates your mitochondria very, very potently. And when mitochondria get stimulated, they make more light in the form of the UV and infrared light. And so it's kind of this perfect, exquisite arrangement that our biology evolved to adapt to these shifts in the external environment by literally making its own light in the absence of proper light inputs from the outside in. I think it was so beautiful when I learned that, and it really hit home to me that UV and infrared light are essential nutrients, full
Mm.
stop, and yet they're the two frequencies of light that we've systematically eradicated from our indoor environments.
Wow, that's fascinating. Is this why you're a fan of cold thermogenesis, and also just normalizing being cold, if that's what nature's roll of the dice is at that moment?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the indoor spaces that we're living in, it's usually between like 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, no UV light, but then also no infrared light either because we're blocking that and we've eliminated from our tech. So it's kind of a conundrum because at that temperature, the body's expecting some UV light, really.
Mm,
Cold temperatures are associated with no UV light. Warm temperatures like that, there should be some UV light, and yet there's nothing going on there. Not to mention the complete absence of near infrared light, which is supposed to be available year round. Even if it's the dead of winter and days are short, you're still getting near infrared light from sun up to sundown, wherever you are at a more northern latitude. And so there's this bizarre environment that the body does not know how to interpret. And yet, getting cold is a very quick antidote to at least solving one of those problems, which is the lack of UV and infrared light, actually. And so, if you can do some targeted cold water immersion in particular, which is much more stimulating and efficient than just like, let's say, walking outside in the cold, which is still beneficial. But the cold water in particular, water is really good at soaking up heat. It has a very
mm,
high thermal heat capacity. It can basically soak up a bunch of heat. So it pulls heat away from your body, which allows your core temperature to drop more quickly, depending on how long you're in there. And then you get more of those adaptations. So when you stimulate your mitochondria when you're getting cold, you're not only, improving mitochondrial light production, you also really give a giant boost to norepinephrine and dopamine production in the brain, which are the exact neurotransmitters that people chase if they're taking stimulant drugs like Adderall.
mm-hmm.
Um, the people who basically will lean towards these drugs, if you can leverage cold, it's going to be massively beneficial because you get way more of a boost with cold than with these substances. And so there's definitely a mental health and like a physical resiliency and a focus benefit to getting cold as well. In addition to the mitochondrial benefit, you're also stimulating the production of beige fat
Mm,
and the expansion of brown fat. So brown fat is a special type of fat that's enriched in mitochondria. Babies are born with about 35% of their fat as brown fat because it allows them to maintain their core body temperature. When anything is like a creature is small, it means that they have a higher surface area to volume ratio, which means that they dissipate more heat. And so it's more challenging for small creatures to maintain their body temperature compared to bigger ones. And so
Mm.
babies have solved for that issue by having more brown fat to make metabolic heat to maintain their core temperature. But the fact is that if you don't get any cold stimulus, that brown fat dwindles over time. And I think it's something like 10% of adult humans are only 10% of adult humans are walking around with detectable brown fat at this point because we are not exposing ourselves to cold. There's programming and like propaganda around like, stay out of the cold, bundle up.
Hmm.
That cold can somehow make you get sick when it's actually the opposite. And if you look at the cultures that are at very northern latitudes, Scandinavia and Russia, they have a very strong cultural practice around getting cold intentionally and also doing sauna and geothermal pools because they know the way to deal with cold times during the winter is actually to get cold and then maybe go back and forth between the hot and the cold because I'm sure they empirically understood that and it improved their health and their outcomes in some way, but now we through the scientific lens can see that there is actually a direct way that this would be supportive through supporting that mitochondrial function in the absence of sufficient light inputs from the sun. And so cold is great in all these ways. And we can really begin to also, I mentioned beige fat before. Beige fat is when white fat, so like your typical subcutaneous fat, starts to get more brown. So through cold exposure, you can make more of your subcutaneous white fat brown-ish. It's like a hybrid kind of.
Mm.
And that brown fat and beige fat is really good at soaking up glucose and fat from the circulation. So from a metabolic health standpoint, absolutely incredible to stimulate the production and the function of these tissues. And one other thing I'll mention before you can jump in, I'm sure you have questions, is that people with hypothyroidism tend to very much avoid the cold
Yeah.
because their metabolism isn't working at a high enough level to actually stimulate the heat production via the mitochondria that can then help to warm them back up essentially. But the problem with that is it becomes this feed forward mechanism, and most doctors will tell their patients to just bundle up and avoid the cold. But as it turns out, there's actually a brown fat thyroid axis whereby when the thyroid produces T4, the brown fat can actually take up T4, which is the inactive thyroid hormone, and spit out T3, which is the active thyroid hormone. And in effect, what you're doing by systematically, gradually increasing your cold exposure as somebody with clinical or subclinical hypothyroidism is that you're increasing your natural ability to harness thyroid hormone function and conversion in the body. And so I think that's one really incredible way that people can start to be, kind of benefit their own health without having to rely on necessarily exogenous substances to do that, which is kind of this feed forward loop that basically if you're taking exogenous thyroid hormone, it shuts down your own production. And then over
Mm.
time, the thyroid just becomes weaker and weaker versus leveraging cold. You can actually develop a stronger thyroid hormone action in the body within the cells, which stimulates mitochondria to work better. And so over time, I hesitate just from like a liability perspective to say that you can reverse your conditions, but that's been my experience with clients and in my own experience as well. So I used to be somebody who always had like cold hands and feet, kind of
Mm.
just sluggish circulation. I would call it like damp stagnation in the context of like herbalism standpoint, like Ayurvedic standpoint. But as soon as I started doing cold exposure, I, now wake up and I'm warm. I'm very warm. My fingers and toes are warm. And so there's this aspect of getting cold acutely can actually make you warmer chronically because you're building your own capacity to generate heat.
Yeah. And that generating heat is generating light. That's fascinating. You're helping me put you're putting words to things that I've felt intuitively for a long time. So, to use I'm a bro scientist. I don't have a PhD, but I understand these analogies and try and think about this anti-fragility idea that you're talking about. Okay, so if you're cold, avoid the cold and bundle up. Well, you become very fragile. Similarly to if you didn't have the strength to get down and up off the ground, and somebody said, okay, just never get down on the ground, then you increasingly get more fragile. Or you could slowly start to load the body, get into a point where you can squat and you can build the strength, and now you're anti-fragile. And in the cold analogy, that's exactly what you're doing, right? You're increasing your tolerance for the cold, not only so you can live more as a natural human, but also deriving benefits from that because you're adapting that kind of hormetic stressor. So every December, I do something called Dippy December. I don't have a fancy Morozko forge or anything like that yet. Morozko, if you're watching, hook your boy up. I just have a
Love them.
Rubbermaid in the back garden. I fill it up. It's like a 150-gallon tub, so it sits there getting, all nice and soaked up by the sun. But it fluctuates with the seasons here in Tennessee. Sometimes that can be really, really cold. It's breaking it with ice with a kettlebell and getting it, and sometimes it's at a nice chill 50 or something like that. But something I do always notice during that month is the profound mental clarity and the buzz that comes after it. And also just, yeah, I think it's the effect of this browning of fat that you mentioned. I don't change much else, but I seem to run warm, run a little bit leaner, and just generally feel good. It's always a bit of a mental challenge getting in there on the days you don't want to, but it's one of those things that afterwards you feel amazing. But I'm curious, in the health space, sometimes there's this new emerging lens of kind of bioenergetics, or the pro metabolic approach will say like minimize stress at all costs because stress is harmful, and most people are already too stressed. So doing things like extreme hormetic stresses like cold is actually harmful. It's harmful especially to women because of the hormonal cycles and things like that. What would you say? Is it just a case of starting slow, or is that an idea that you challenge?
Yeah, so I actually like this question, and it also makes me think of Jordan Peterson's perspective on stress, which I really love and subscribe to, which is that there's a big difference between stress taken on forthrightly and stress being thrust upon you involuntarily. It's actually a difference at the level of your neurochemistry. So if you're a victim to your life and the stress is being thrust upon you and you feel like you can't handle it and you're not even going to try, that's extremely damaging and will literally, break you down. It will create burnout. That's in contrast to stress taken on forthrightly, like something it comes into your sphere and you decide that you're going to actually do something
Mm,
about it, whether it's like engaging voluntarily in exercise, cold exposure, or engaging in a tough conversation with a coworker or a loved one or anything like that. If you do that, you're actually then engaging your dopamine and norepinephrine pathways that gives you a reward for doing the hard thing. If you have hard things thrust upon you, you don't get a reward for dealing with it because you're not actually engaging the pathways in the brain that say like, okay, you voluntarily engaged in this thing and you succeeded and now you get a
mm,
reward for it. And so there's a big difference between those two. And so I think, number one, we can't force people to do anything in general. You can only really lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink, etc. So I think just giving good advice, especially when it comes to cold, starting slow. Like you don't have to go crazy, and especially for women. And Jack talks about this in general for the metabolic benefits of cold. 50 to 55-degree Fahrenheit water is perfectly fine and
right.
enough to get the adaptations. And even only doing it a couple times a week. But the thing is that you want to work up to is doing a bit longer sessions because there's actually two different responses you can get to cold depending on the duration of the exposure. So if you're
Mm,
only going in for 2 to 5 minutes, let's say, you're decreasing your skin temperature, but you're actually increasing your core temperature because all the blood is being pushed inside. And so that's one response. The other response would be if you're staying in for like 20 to 45 minutes, now you're actually beginning to decrease your core temperature. And this relates to the quantum biology of cold exposure because if we think about what our bodies are made of, and we look back on the work of Albert St. Georgi, who won the Nobel Prize for vitamin C metabolism back in maybe the 40s, and Robert O. Becker, who is the author of the book Cross Currents and the Body Electric, he was basically the father of non-native EMF research, and he shed a lot of light before getting canceled. He was one of the first canceled scientists on the
mm,
harms of non-native EMFs. But he was graduating from medical school, and St. George was giving a talk, and he said, it's curious, but it seems like biology is encoding semiconductors, that all proteins in the body are semiconductors. And semiconductors being the same things that are in your phones and your computers, like the things that are allowing electricity to flow given specific constraints. And so our bodies are also made of these semiconductors. And if you look in physics labs when they're studying semiconductive materials, they always study them at cool temperatures because they work better at
mm,
cooler temperatures. And so what you're doing when you're getting cold for longer periods of time is you're actually improving the efficiency of your semiconductor networks, which means in effect you're transmitting energy and light through the body more efficiently at that cooler temperature. And so that's why it can be at like a quantum biological level so healing for a system, especially somebody who, is, well, either if you're trying to avoid chronic disease issues or actively have one, that there's this immense payout to be had from engaging in intentional cold water immersion between 50 and 55 degrees for 20 to 45 minutes, 2 to 5 times a week. And I think that women, we tend to do better with a bit less. So I did a lot of experimenting myself when I first got my Morosco in August, and I was plunging like every day for like, I would do maybe 2 or 3 5-minute sessions, and then a couple days I would do like 15, 20-minute sessions. And I did notice my cycle shifting around a little bit. It was nothing crazy, but my luteal phase was extended by like 3 days. My ovulation was like 2 days earlier than it would have been predicted. And I track my cycles and my hormones. So I'm like very on top of it.
mm,
And so I could see that things were shifting around a little bit. So what I did is now I plunge every other day. One day, so it's basically 3 days a week. One day I'll do like 10 minutes. The other 2 days I'll do between 20 and 35, 40 minutes. And with that, I've had no issues whatsoever. And so there's going to be some variability here, and especially for women, cycling women, I urge them to like track their hormones and do their own N of one, because it's
Mm,
really hard to have a scientific study that's like an average across the population to tell you what to do. Whenever we do that, we're taking all of the outliers out of the data sets. And that's actually an issue because we care about the outliers. For the N of one context, we want to know what your response is, not
mm,
what the average response is. And so I personally use the Anito fertility monitor, INITO, that allows you to track estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone every day with like a morning urine test. Takes 10 minutes in
wow.
combination with natural cycles, which is a morning basal body temperature test that allows you to also track ovulation, because post ovulation, when progesterone goes up, that corresponds with an increase in basal body temperature by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And so it's very easy to track these things. It's also an incredible way to get in tune with your body as a woman. And so I think it's a great way to just understand how you're responding to new stimuli that you're giving yourself, including cold and whatever else. And so I think that's the best context for women to think about this. And for men, y'all tend to tolerate a lot more stress in general. Your
Mm,
bodies are much more resilient. And if you're looking for a hormonal benefit from cold, the research would suggest that if you do your cold water immersion for however long and then you go exercise after, that you get quite a significant boost in testosterone levels relative to women who can just do cold and get a testosterone boost without exercising after. So there is some dimorphism there across the sexes. And men also tend to tolerate colder temperatures more easily or readily as well. And so, depending on what benefits you're looking to get, like I said, 50 to 55-degree water for the metabolic, mitochondrial, semiconductor benefits. For the psychological resilience benefits, Dr. Tom Seeger would suggest like 40 degrees or lower for
mm.
like 90 seconds to a few minutes would be a good choice if you're looking for that grittiness and like improving your discipline and like your just like strength of will and things like that. So there's some nuance there, but hopefully that's helpful for people.
That's super helpful. Yeah, I love that breakdown and the nuance. I think the mistake we make sometimes is, again, probably one of the issues with a lot of science as well is it's very male dominated, right? And then we try to turn women or give women protocols like they are little men, and they're not, and they have
Yeah.
very different systems. And I think also a little bit of a dick swinging competition online, like who can do the coldest, right? If you
Yeah.
if you're the guy out there breaking the ice with the sledgehammer, you get the badass points, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary to go that hard. That you can get a lot of benefits at a much more approachable temperature, like in the 50s. I
Yes.
actually am very happy to hear that. You don't need to always
Yes.
go to that dark place, which is cool. So, bouncing back from the cold into the sun, I want to come back to the cold in a minute because in the northern hemisphere we are going to be entering winter here shortly. But I want to close this loop on sun exposure because obviously one of the issues, and you started to tease this a little bit at the beginning, that it's a misconception that the sun causes skin cancer. Can you just break that down a little bit more for me? Because this seems to be a myth that I've woken up to, but it won't die. It just won't go away. Is it purely just the sheer amount of propaganda? But I would love your scientific kind of perspective on why the sun doesn't solely cause skin cancer, at least.
Yeah, so there's nuance that's required in this conversation too. So if we look at the published literature in the dermatology research, we can see that chronic regular sun exposure, which basically means daily sun exposure, is inversely associated with melanoma incidence and severity. So if you're getting out in the sun every day, you're less likely to get melanoma, and if you do get it, it's going to be less severe. That's in contrast to intermittent sun exposure, which would basically be you work an office job, you never go outside, and then you go on vacation to, I don't know, Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, and you
Hmm.
fry yourself for a few days, and then you go back home. That is actually positively associated with melanoma and other types of skin cancers, getting basically fried and crisped and burned, especially at younger ages, but throughout life as well.
Mm,
So, this is kind of the misconception here. Like, just because you go out in the sun doesn't mean you have to burn. Burning is not inevitable. And there's also a lot of behaviors that we're engaging in as modern humans that's setting us up to burn, which includes blue light exposure, because the blue light on our skin impairs mitochondrial function, and those mitochondria are required to make new melanin in the skin. So if we're impairing mitochondria there, we're also setting ourselves up to not make as much melanin or as efficiently in response to the sun, so getting less of a tan. If we also look at the non-native EMFs in our environment, they're also impairing mitochondrial function on our surfaces, which again directly relates to our ability to make new melanin and tan in response to the sun. We also have things like people wearing sunglasses, contacts, prescription lenses while they're tanning or sunning. That's also problematic because, as it turns out, when you make POMC, in response to UVB light. It's made both in the brain via the eyes and in the skin. And so, if we want to maximize the concentration of those MSHs, those melanocyte stimulating hormones that I talked about earlier, we need both the eyes and the skin exposed in tandem. That's
Mm,
going to increase the production of those MSHs at the same time, so the total concentration is higher. Compared to if we're wearing sunglasses and blocking that UV light into the eye, that doesn't mean, again, like to stare directly at the sun. It just means getting ambient light into your eyes. Then if you're blocking that, you're only getting one part of the puzzle, and so your total concentrations of these molecules are going to be less, so you're not going to be stimulating melanin production as much as you otherwise would have. This is
mm,
especially important for people who are very fair skinned because you're already going to be more likely to burn to begin with. And it's kind of a catch 22 because people who are more likely to wear sunglasses are the people with lighter eyes who have a little bit more sensitivity to light because their eye color, let's say, like blue or green, any sort of light eye color, is more adapted to northern climates where there's less bright sun year round, let's say, or less total solar yield. But what I will say about that is the more you go without sunglasses, the more you'll be able to tolerate bright light.
yes.
I've had so many clients who, stopped wearing sunglasses cold turkey in the beginning. They were like squinting when they were outside, but over the course of a couple weeks, they naturally just gained their they basically built up kind of like a tolerance to that brightness in the same way that you can build a quote unquote solar callus, as Jack would say, for
Mm,
your skin, which is basically building up a tan through gradual graded sun exposure. In a similar way, your eyes can become adapted to brighter environments as well, given the stimulus. And so those are three big ones that I would say that people don't necessarily do. Like they go
yeah.
from 0 to 100 too often. That can result in burning. They're not being mindful of their light environments when they're inside. Oh, another good one is actually seeing sunrise and sunset, actually, because as it turns out, there's literature showing that if you expose your body to red and infrared light before UV light, you burn less.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
the best natural source of red and infrared light is sunrise and sunset. So if you see the sunrise that morning and then you're tanning later in the day, you're going to be able to mount a melanation response more easily compared to somebody who hasn't. You can also leverage like red and infrared light panels. Those studies used like red and infrared light panels, so that wasn't even leveraging sunrise. So if you want to do it the natural way, see sunrise, and I urge everybody to get out in morning light
Yeah.
regardless. But from a sunburn perspective, you could also leverage red and infrared light panels before going out for a sunning session, and that can also help prevent burning from occurring. So those would be some big things: not blocking UV light into the eyes, seeing sunrise or using a red and infrared light panel before laying out, gradually increasing your sun exposure over time, not going from 0 to 100, and minding your indoor light environment to reduce your blue light exposure.
Yeah, you're describing in a nutshell my journey with this as well. I am fair skinned, white skin, freckles, green eyes, ginger beard. So very pale, very prone to burning when I was younger. As I've gotten older and become aware of some of these healthy light behaviors, I've ditched the sunglasses. I used to have very sensitive eyes. If I forgot my sunglasses at the beach, it would be a headache from all the squinting. Now I don't even own a pair. I don't need them. I can go anywhere. I can be on water and all kinds of stuff, and I feel fine. And it's very, very difficult for me these days to get burned. And I think fundamentally I have a lot of these base layer behaviors in, like you said, even if I travel to a completely different location, I fly across the world and go to Bali where the UV index is a 12. I'll get my circadian rhythm lined up. I'll get out and I'll watch the sunrise. I'll also be smart. I'm not going to be out at 1 p.m. in the afternoon sunbathing for 90 minutes straight. But from a guy that used to get sunburn with any kind of look at the sun, kind of lived like a vampire, to somebody now that is, a ginger that carries a pretty good tan year round, it's totally possible, and also totally possible to ditch the sunglasses as well. But I must
Totally.
ask
I
you,
actually have a couple things that you just reminded me to mention.
yeah,
So there's also a circadian component to tanning versus burning. So as it turns out, there's clocks in your skin cells, just like there's clocks in all your other cells. And so if your circadian rhythm is disrupted because you're not getting enough bright light from the sun during the day and you're blasting yourself with blue light at night, that also throws off your skin clocks, which are required to properly mount melanin response to the
mm,
sun as well. So there is a circadian component there that's important to mention. There's also potentially a dietary component too, and I actually want to study this in my future lab, because I've heard so many times that people like started eating an animal-based diet, like
yep,
whole foods. They cut out all the seed oils and the processed foods, and they stop burning.
yep,
And I've heard this from a couple people who are also very fair, and they always burn. And they just literally stop burning. And so I think there is some aspect too to the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in the diet, and also the total amount of PUFAs in the diet
yep,
relative to saturated fats. we know that the skin is like a sacrificial layer. It turns over very quickly. And so the fats that we're taking in through the diet actually can directly affect the fat composition of the cell membranes in the skin. And if we think about PUFAs, in particular, like the omega-6 fats, which are already pro-inflammatory just due to the pathway by which they're metabolized to arachidonic acid, we can also look at them in the context of their stability, and the PUFAs in general are very easily oxidized. They're very easily broken down because they have these double bonds that are points of vulnerability. And so if we're consuming a lot of processed foods and a lot of processed seed oils in particular that are highly enriched in these omega-6 fats that are already coming to us oxidized, and that's why they have to deodorize them and they scrub them so diligently to avoid having like a pungent odor that you wouldn't want to use it. It's just like disgusting if you look at the way these oils are made. And then you're consuming those, and if you're consuming them at a high enough quantity, that's actually influencing the cell membrane
Hmm.
composition. So you could have oxidized lipids within your cell membranes that can make your skin more vulnerable to being damaged in response to the sun. So I think there's absolutely a dietary component there that is very actionable, and people can, start to make choices that, honestly, this comes back to the saturated fat conversation as well, because I think the demonization of saturated fat, we don't have any studies with light controls in general. So I would love
Mm.
to see, like, in natural light, I bet we're not going to get any of the, deleterious or stated deleterious effects of saturated fat on blood lipid levels. I think that story is already falling apart as it is. But that saturated fats, because there's no double bonds, they stack really nicely on top of each other and they form very strong structures.
Hmm.
And so if you have that in your skin, that's actually developing a more robust structure to damage and to being, let's say, inflamed in response to excessive sun exposure, which is what sunburn is. So those are a couple other, the circadian component and the dietary component, I think, are also important aspects to this story.
So good. Yeah. If your nemesis is blue light, I know you've got a few, but if that's the big one, my nemesis is the seed oil. So I love that rant. I think you're on point, and I think we've got thousands of bits of anecdata at this point of that very story, and which is really powerful. And another aspect to this decentralized model of questioning the cholesterol hypothesis and the saturated fat hypothesis just ancestrally doesn't line up. And before we move on to food a little bit more, I must ask you this selfishly a little bit, but also because I think it's a fun one. I don't think I've ever really heard anybody talk about this, particularly a scientist. What is the scientific take on sunning your balls?
Well, actually, so I like to talk about this a decent amount because for both men and women, there's certain times of day where sunning your fun parts is beneficial. I would say in general, like, let's say sunrise, sunset, we're getting highly enriched red and infrared light. We know that directly stimulates mitochondria. The testes and the ovaries are both enriched in mitochondria, so we need to support those tissues. It makes sense to directly stimulate them. But in addition to that, we also have UVA light, which we didn't talk about yet, but UVA light, which is a slightly longer wavelength than UVB light, is a really important stimulus of nitric oxide production throughout the body. And nitric oxide being this critical reactive species that's required for the dilation of blood vessels, which allows blood pressure to be going down.
Hmm.
It also facilitates the perfusion of tissues, so the delivery of nutrients and oxygen to tissues, and the removal of waste from tissues as well. And a lot of people in let's say gym bro space will think about nitric oxide and taking nitric oxide boosters and things like this through like arginine, citrulline, etc., not realizing that UVA light is a primary stimulus of nitric oxide in the body via the
Mm.
skin. So, but the one caveat to that is the more skin you have exposed, the more nitric oxide you produce. And that's because nitric oxide is produced locally in the skin in response to UVA light, and then it diffuses into the bloodstream. And so, from an erectile dysfunction perspective, and also from a sexual function perspective in women too, nitric oxide is extremely important for
Mm.
facilitating blood flow to those regions. And so, that's a huge benefit for getting even more of that early morning UV light or even midday UV light exposure on those regions too, from a blood flow perspective and a sexual function perspective. So I think there's absolutely merit to it. Also, it feels really good. So
Hmm.
just subjectively, anybody who does it, I mean, I've personally done that very frequently. I was just doing it earlier today and it feels amazing. And so I think there's some natural inclination that if it feels good, it tends to be good for you outside of like highly addictive substances that are
Right.
engineered to be that way. In nature, if something feels good, it's kind of implied that we're actually supposed to lean into that.
I love it. PhD approved. Sun your fun parts. Let's go. I've been enjoying that endeavor for a while. Be Have some fun with it on my Instagram stories and all of that stuff. So, um, the one thing is a little bit of a tangent, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this. Why I had you on the call. which is so you kind of started with this story about the eyes. And Dr. Jack Kruse has this line, it's beautiful. He's like, people mistake the eyes as vision centers when they're actually clocks that tell the time using light. And the eyes are very unique because they're kind of an externalized aspect of the brain, like outside of the skull. Now, I'm curious about LASIK because that then is a surgery on a part of the brain and everybody's getting it to fix their vision. But is there some potential negative consequences with something like LASIK?
Absolutely. There's a couple different eye procedures that are important to mention here. So there's the LASIK and there's also the cataract surgeries as well. So in LASIK, what they're doing essentially is reshaping the cornea to make it a shape that's more conducive to you seeing clearly. The problem with that is if we look at what the cornea contains, there are photoreceptors in the cornea, in particular neuropsin and melanopsin. Neuropsin is a UVA light detector and melanopsin is a blue light detector.
Hmm.
And we know at the very least that these photoreceptors in the cornea play an important role in the clock mechanisms within the cornea, but there's likely knock on effects to other parts of the eye and possibly even to the brain as well. And if you actually look up, case reports of people having adverse outcomes from LASIK, there's a pretty decent sized population that get depressed after LASIK surgery
Hmm.
and some like suicidally depressed. And there's some actually pretty big stories of like more notable people that ended up killing themselves after getting LASIK surgery and or families saying like they were never the same after they had this done. And so it makes sense when we think about the absolutely crucial role of light being transmitted through the eye in order to set the clock mechanisms, which have such important roles with regards to neurochemistry and honestly the chemistry of the whole body, because that central clock mechanism is helping the whole body to tell time. Every cell has these clocks that's basically looking for that master clock to understand what time of day it is. And so things could go wrong pretty quickly
Yeah.
if that timing mechanism becomes off. On the other side of that, cataracts, we have a big issue with cataracts because the lenses that they put into the eyes block UV light. And so if you're putting lenses into the eye, artificial lenses that block UV light, now you're missing the mechanism that allows you to engage POMC in the brain in response to
Wow.
UVB light. And so there's huge implications there. I think at the very least, what I tell people who already had it done and like they can't do anything about it really is to just increase their total amount of time outside,
Yeah.
because certainly it's likely not blocking 100% of UVB light. Typically things aren't that efficient, but even if you can get a few percent of UV light through if you're out there for a longer period of time, better than nothing, I think. And really making sure that you're getting enough production via the skin as well is going to be important to help compensate for that. It's not perfect, but it's way better than like doing nothing at all. And there's even some cataract lenses available now that block blue light too, which is crazy because blue light is critical for setting that clock behind the eye that's connected to the retina. And so it's crazy to think that we would block blue light coming into the eye when it has this such crucial mechanism for the circadian timekeeping aspects of our biology. And so if you can avoid cataract surgeries, like I would absolutely avoid it. We really need to do better with our tech development in that area to
Right.
understand the pitfalls of blocking something like UV light instead of just myopically focusing on the risks of it and not focusing at all on the benefits of it. And I think that's my biggest beef with the whole centralized paradigm is that, in every other aspect of life, we talk about risk benefit analysis. When it comes to the sun, it's like we're only going to talk about the risks, no benefits, even though the literature is chock full of benefits to
Mm.
getting sun exposure. And I would argue that if you look clearly and unbiasedly at the research, you could clearly make a case that getting more sun exposure is critical from a human health standpoint, not less. For example, I mentioned earlier that more sun exposure, chronic regular sun exposure, is associated with lower rates of cardiovascular disease, colon cancer, breast cancer, blood cancers, prostate cancer, dementia and cognitive decline, neurodegeneration, Parkinson's disease. What else? Cardiovascular disease. I think I said it already. The top two killers in our country are cardiovascular and neurodegeneration. Cancer's not too far behind. Among those cancers, breast is right up there. And colon as well. So if we think about that, getting more sun, we're protected against like some of the top killers in our country. Meanwhile, the squamous and basal cell carcinomas that are somewhat associated with sun exposure, but I would argue more on the burning side of things, not the tanning side of things, they have next to zero death rate.
Mm.
And the melanomas are actually protected against with chronic regular sun exposure. So if we really look at the risk benefit, there's clearly a major benefit to going out and getting more sun to avoid all of the top killers that we're facing societally. And the slight aspect or the slight chance of getting some sun caused issue can be mitigated completely by building your solar callus gradually over time
Yeah.
and being smart about it.
Yeah. What a paradigm shift. I love that. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Mm, as we get ready to transition seasonally here, one of the things that I'd like to spend just the last few minutes on here with you is this idea of seasonal eating and the light information that's contained within food. Somebody said once to me, and it really landed, it might be a Jackism, that uh, food is light slowed down into mass, that it carries an information of seasonality and stuff. So like the animal-based diet, we I think we get so much of it right. The elimination of hyperpalatable processed foods, the elimination of toxic seed oils, including nose to tail nutrition, eating protein, eating organ meats, bone broths, all of that good stuff. But also like the inclusion of fruit, which is a wonderful food, but can it be metabolically confusing to consume a Costa Rican pineapple in the dead of winter if you live in New Jersey, for example? Like, what's your take on the whole seasonal thing?
Totally. So I fully subscribe to seasonal eating for a multitude of reasons. Like the only reason we have access to tropical fruits in New England, let's say, is because of the global food supply chain, which is one of the most unsustainable aspects of our global society. I think if we're focusing on, reducing pollution, which most people don't talk about pollution, they'll say global warming or climate change as this nebulous concept that
Mm,
like it sounds so nebulous that you couldn't have possibly anything to do with it. But if we talk about pollution, it becomes much more clear like how we're contributing to it at the individual level. And when it comes to purchasing foods that were flown halfway across the world, that is just like, one of the biggest offenders, so to speak. And so I think talking about this conversation and like demonizing cows versus talking about the global food supply chain is just wild and misguided in my opinion. But when it comes to eating seasonally, there's a lot of information in food packed into that food that's telling your mitochondria something about your environment. And one of the areas I really like to focus on is deuterium, which is a little bit of a can of worms, but essentially I mentioned hydrogen earlier, how you're eating for protons and electrons, protons being H plus hydrogen. Most protons are in the form of protium, which is light hydrogen. It's just a proton and an electron. Deuterium is a heavy form of hydrogen that has a neutron. So it's a proton, electron, and a neutron. Because it has this neutron, it's a bigger atom. So if we look at how the electron transport chain works, essentially what it is there's four protein complexes that pump protons into something called the intermembrane space. So in the mitochondria, there's two membranes. There's an inner and an outer membrane. Between the inner and outer membrane is the intermembrane space. Inside the inner membrane is the inner matrix. So as the electrons are flowing through the protein complexes, protons get pumped into the intermembrane space and they come back into the inner matrix through a complex called ATP synthase, which is literally a nano rotor that spins as those protons come back through. And while it spins, it's producing ATP from ADP and it's also making metabolic water, deuterium depleted metabolic water in particular. And that'll become more important in a moment. So the problem is deuterium doesn't fit through the hole in ATP synthase that allows that rotor to turn. And so mitochondria hate deuterium. Most of the deuterium in the body is kept in the bloodstream. Side note, the only cells in the adult body that don't have mitochondria are the red blood cells, and that should make sense why,
mm,
those cells wouldn't have mitochondria because they wouldn't be able to deal with the high deuterium environment. So the mitochondria basically push the deuterium out and keep the protium in, which allows that mechanism, that pumping mechanism, to occur more successfully and efficiently. So, as it turns out, if we look at the foods that are highest in deuterium and lowest in deuterium, the low deuterium foods are animal fats and animal proteins, animal fats being the absolute lowest deuterium. The highest deuterium foods are our roots and fruits, our carbohydrate containing foods. The green parts of plants are lower in deuterium because chloroplasts, which make plants green via the chlorophyll, actually operate similarly to mitochondria. So the green parts of plants are a bit lower in deuterium,
mm.
not as low as animal fats, but in the realm. Versus the roots and the fruits are highly enriched in deuterium. The plant pushes their deuterium there to get it away from the green parts.
Hmm.
And so if we're eating a lot of carbohydrate, like plant-based foods in the wintertime, we're dousing our systems with deuterium that it doesn't know how to handle because if you live somewhere where the ground freezes, you can't grow plant foods. You won't
Right.
have them. All you'll really have is, access to animal foods. You might have some ferments, you might have some berries, you may have some root vegetables, but not very much.
Right.
Most of the diet calories are going to be coming from the fats and the protein in the animal foods, which are the low deuterium foods. And so it's exquisite that nature basically says if you live somewhere north, you're supposed to eat a more animal based diet because that will allow you to not only keep your deuterium levels at a lower level throughout the winter when the sun quality is lower. Because, as a side note, when the sun quality is higher and the temperatures are higher, you're able to deplete deuterium more easily. One
Mm.
of the primary mechanisms is through sweating that you can deplete deuterium. There's also independent mechanisms via high quality sunlight that you can handle it a bit more efficiently. Partially that's through the melanin mechanism in the skin, through the splitting of water, but also the reformation of water that excludes deuterium. But that's kind of an aside. So what nature's saying is, if the temperatures are cold, you're not able to deplete deuterium as much, which means that you should be eating more animal-based foods, which are going to be the foods that are available anyways. Compared to the summertime, when plant foods are abundant, your body now has a mechanism to deal with that deuterium load that's coming in through the sweating mechanism and through the high quality sun light exposure that's allowing your body to basically process that deuterium more efficiently, so it's not going to burden the mitochondria and start to break those engines down. So if we look
Mm.
at this just from a deuterium perspective, we can really clearly see the argument for seasonal eating, in that we need to maintain healthy levels of deuterium to not begin to break our mitochondrial engines down. And that's another reason why deuterium depleted water has become so apparently therapeutic in the context of cancer and diabetes. I also use it in the performance optimization context with athletes as well. I also use deuterium depleted water before I fly or engage in any sort of a stressful environment, because essentially it could just help the mitochondria to work a
Mm.
little bit more better. It's kind of like greasing the engine. And essentially, what that's doing is, if you're drinking deuterium depleted water, it's allowing you to deplete deuterium in a different way. Because when you drink deuterium depleted water, it lowers the levels of deuterium in the bloodstream. And then to reestablish equilibrium, the body will essentially pull deuterium out of the tissue to put it back into the bloodstream. And so, in effect, you're depleting deuterium from the tissue by drinking deuterium depleted water. And
Mm.
so, that's one way to deal with a higher deuterium load, but the best way to do it at just like a baseline level for somebody who's already healthy and wants to stay that way is just to leverage a seasonal diet, get cold. There's the added benefit of, when you eat a more animal-based diet that's higher in fat and protein, it also activates your brown fat through ketosis more as well.
Mm.
And so when you eat a more animal-based diet, you're also better able to engage that brown fat that makes metabolic heat for you. And so it's everything is yoked together, and it makes perfect sense that it should be, because that's the environment that our ancestors came up in, and that's what
Mm.
shaped who we are essentially. And so seasonal diet makes perfect sense to me. As long as you're also engaging in like intentional cold exposure in the winter, that's kind of a perfect scenario where you're eating more animal based and getting cold. And then in the summertime, you're getting outside more in full spectrum sun. You can have
Right.
more diverse array of foods. DHA, which is the long chain omega 3, is important around the year, I would argue, from a quantum biologic perspective, but also an inflammatory status perspective and just an overall health perspective as well, that we would have access to some sort of sea creatures to
Mm-hmm.
consume. Among the land animals, lamb is the highest in DHA. So
Mm.
if you don't have access to seafood for whatever reason, you could leverage something like lamb. Though I would say that if you can get some fish roe in particular, that's a really good way to get
Yeah.
some DHA that's very bioavailable into your body. But that's what I would say about the eating part of things. I think that's kind of how I lay out the story to my clients and students with regards to deuterium. There's also a case to be made for biophotons within food as well, that contain information that's communicating with your mitochondria. I think we need more research in that area.
Right.
Um, but yeah, also the longer food sits on a shelf and like the older the meat is that you're getting, the less light is in that food, the less vital
Mm.
that food is. I think we really need to shift our understanding of food to not only being energy, like we think about it as being energy, and even the hyper processed foods contain energy, but they don't contain the information needed to assimilate that energy. And food really needs to be thought of as energy and information. And the information component could be micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, biophotons. There's lots of different forms of energy, or rather information, that can be packed into a food. Also, the ratio of different micronutrients with macronutrients and biophotons. Like the food matrix is very complex.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're really ever going to be able to fully understand it. I don't think we have to either. I think it's really something that we more so just need to lean into the ancestral wisdom and like nature's wisdom around this,
Yeah.
versus trying to intellectualize every dang thing that we do.
Yeah. Well, what's really cool about you as well is you've gone to the depths of the intellectual understanding of things to validate the ancestral wisdom, and I think that's beautiful. It's just so simple, right? It's when you can break down these very complex processes and affirm that yes, nature knows. The intelligence is built in. Like the divine intelligence is so smart that it put the medicine in living consistently with the laws of nature and man and modern humans so dumb that we become fearful of all the things that nature provided us, the most healthy things, and now we're terrified of them. So
Yeah, although I do see it as like an important process of our evolution. Like, let's say the evolution of our consciousness. Like, we kind of needed to separate from it, like rebellious teens, to
right.
ultimately come back to it in a mindful way. Because it would be
Hmm.
very easy to live in accordance with nature unconsciously and just do it like our ancestors did. But we had to actually create the separation so we could actually see the majesty of it in some way.
Such a good point. Yeah, very well said. So we're going to start wrapping this one up. I'm endlessly fascinated with everything that you're putting out. I think there's a future conversation here too, but I'm just going to offer you the floor to talk about whatever you're into. I know the Light Lab is fascinating. You're in the year of trying to steer things culturally from a health perspective. Like what is really exciting for Alexis right now? What are you excited about? And then on top of that, where can people go to keep up with your journey and everything you're putting out in the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I'm really kind of along for the ride on this. Everything has been very spontaneous. I haven't planned a dang thing about my entire like trajectory, even going to grad school and all of that. I was just following opportunities. And so opportunities have presented themselves. I'm working with Nicole Shanahan on some research projects right now, which is really exciting. I'm also working on hopefully funding and building out a light lab in the future. So I really want to do some good decentralized science where I'm going to be basically revisiting a lot of old studies that didn't have light controls and try to understand that in the context of natural light, what
Yeah.
results do we get? Because if we're looking at like metabolism studies, I did a ton of metabolism studies at Princeton, but they were all under fluorescent lights. And so, like, we need to redo some studies in the context of natural sunlight and see what the outcomes are because my hypothesis is that they would be quite different. And that's what Jack would assert as well. We also just need to do more human studies in general, and we need to get people past this like concept of there's no such thing as a healthy tan because it couldn't be further from the truth. We didn't talk about the other functions of melanin, but in addition to allowing you to harness free energy, it's also a primary heavy metal detoxifier, so it can pull heavy metals out of the bloodstream, which makes it really important in the context of like detoxification. Melanin is also in deep parts of the brain, such as the substantia nigra and the locus coeruleus, where it is a primary defect in the substantia nigra in Parkinson's disease. And so we also see melanin in areas like the oral mucosa, the nasal mucosa, the inner ear. Melanin plays a really important role in scavenging free radicals, so it helps to quench inflammatory environments essentially, which is great. But if you never get out of that toxic environment, then the melanin gets terminally degraded, and now you actually lose the melanin and that protection. And so we really need to understand that when you stimulate melanin on your surfaces on your skin and get a tan, you're not only stimulating melanin there, but deep in your body as well. And it has a
Mm,
very deeply, it allows you to build deep resilience at some level. And so I think we need way more research into melanin and human photosynthesis, which is what it's called when you like harness energy from the sun via melanin. And so I'm excited to do some studies in that department as well. I'm going to be going to El Salvador in like 3 weeks to visit Jack
heck yeah.
and also give a talk. So I'm really excited. I'm going to be there for like a week and a half to soak up some rays as well. And yeah, so that's kind of what I'm up to now. I'm teaching a live course right now called the Boot Camp Reboot, where I'm teaching like basically protocols based approaches to all of these areas of quantum biology and performance and health optimization, cognition, long COVID, and post jab remediation as well,
Hmm.
gut health, microbiome health. We didn't get into that, but there's a whole quantum biology component to that too, with regards to light and the interface between our biology and our environment throughout the seasons. So I'm teaching that course now. It'll be live for like another 3 or 4 weeks. I also have an ebook for all beginners. They can read that. It's very straight and to the point. I've even had sixth graders read it.
Excellent.
I gave a talk to a high school about these concepts a couple weeks ago as well. I literally had a middle schooler interview me for a school project based on the ebook, which was really neat. And I'm just trying to get the information out at like the most simple level possible so that
Mm,
anybody can digest it and begin to like incorporate some small changes in their life to build momentum in a really positive direction. And it's literally fun for all ages. My stepson's 13 and he wears his blue blockers every night. He has red
oh,
light
let's
bulbs in
go.
his room. Like he's in the cold plunge too. And like, so if you can
Amazing.
start kids young, they'll be so resilient if you can do that because
Right.
especially the kids, like they don't have fully myelinated brains until they're about 25 years old, which means they're highly susceptible to blue
Mm,
light and non-native EMFs because they don't have that myelin coating in their central
mm,
nervous system to protect them. And yet we're blasting them with screens in school now, and then they're on
right.
screens when they get home. They're
Right.
under awful lighting at school. They're surrounded by Wi-Fi all day if they're never getting outside to play, and like they literally get less outside time than prisoners do. And so we really need to do some reform with regards to the education system and the environments that these kids are being brought up in, because it's just setting them up for a lifetime of suffering essentially and disease. And we can do so much better. And even small changes in kids though, like they can like basically build back resilience very quickly. Their bodies are very plastic. They have a lot of dynamic ability to adapt to changing environments. And so even if we can do small things to just mitigate their blue light exposure, using red light bulbs at night, having them wear blue blockers, have the whole family do it so it's like the cool thing to do. And just getting them outside more, go and watch sunrise together before school, get your bare feet on the earth, like just play outside. Let's just get them back into nature, and really magic can happen. And so that's really what I'm focused on, is getting the message out to everybody, including kids. Really helping people to build not only physical resilience, but also the mental clarity to see reality for what it is and begin to build a future that's brighter and more healthy.
So freaking good. So good. I'm going to be watching, just keep saying yes to all these little intuitive doors that are opening, because it's taking you on quite a journey. And I'm very thankful that you're in the fight. I think the way you communicate information is approachable, and you make it accessible and also passionate and all of it. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Dr. Alexis Cowan, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be seeing you on the show again in the future.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you. And you lot, stay radical. Go get outside, okay? And make sure you follow Alexis, and we'll see you next time. Peace. Hey, before you go anywhere, listen up. I've got a special announcement. Mark your calendars for this one. November 22nd, Heart and Soil is dropping a new documentary called Fed a Lie. This is going to be the documentary on seed oils. The end, the nail in the coffin. Expect to hear from experts like Dr. Paul Saladino, Nina Teicholz, Dr. Chris Kenobi, even superstars like Bethany Hamilton, as we gathered the big dogs to put an end to the seed oil madness. If you want to check that out, go to Heart and Soil's YouTube, subscribe, and go to fedalie.film. Plug in your details, and we will make sure you get the link as soon as that goes live so you can spread it far and wide. This will be an incredible conversation starter at the family table over the holidays, and it will be you helping us to spread this message of radical health and be a part of the healthy revolution. And as always, thank you for being here. If you like the show, please like it, subscribe it, and share it. Help us to spread this message of radical health. And we'll see you next week. Big love.